Some people think dignity disappears the moment someone laughs at you. They are wrong. Sometimes, dignity walks into the room wearing a black suit and says nothing at all. The rain had been tapping against the ballroom windows since sunset, turning the Manhattan skyline into a watercolor of silver lights and blurred reflections. I adjusted the tray in my hands for what felt like the 100th time that evening, reminding myself that one more shift meant one more payment toward nursing school. 24 years old, working 2 jobs, surviving on coffee and determination, I had learned to smile even when my feet ached after 10 straight hours. The Langford Charity Gala was unlike anywhere I had ever worked. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead. A string quartet floated soft music through the air. Women wore gowns that probably cost more than my car, and men compared watches worth more than my entire student loan balance. I moved quietly between marble columns, refilling champagne glasses and pretending I belonged in a world that had never noticed people like me unless something went wrong. My name tag read Claire Bennett in simple black letters. Most guests never looked that low. They saw the tray before they saw the woman carrying it. That was fine with me. Invisible people made fewer mistakes. At least that was what I believed until everything changed. Table 17 sat near the center of the ballroom beneath a towering arrangement of white orchids. 4 executives laughed louder than anyone else in the room, surrounded by expensive suits and louder opinions. As I stepped beside them with a fresh bottle of Cabernet, one of the men barely glanced in my direction before waving his hand carelessly. His elbow brushed the bottle. Or maybe it didn't. Even years later, I could never decide whether it was an accident or a choice. The deep red wine splashed across the front of my cream-colored uniform, spreading like watercolor across the fabric before dripping onto the polished marble floor. The conversation around us stopped for exactly 1 heartbeat. Then came the laughter. Not everyone laughed, but enough people did. Quiet chuckles, smirks hidden behind champagne glasses, eyes that looked at me with amusement instead of concern. My cheeks burned hotter than the wine soaking through my clothes. I whispered an apology automatically, even though I wasn't sure what I had done wrong. Training teaches you that customers are always right. Pride teaches you nothing when you're standing in stained clothes beneath 1,000 glittering lights. I reached for the linen napkins with trembling fingers, hoping I could clean the floor before anyone noticed the mess spreading around my shoes. The man shrugged as if nothing important had happened. "Relax," he said with a lazy grin. "It's just a dress. Just a dress." Funny how people only call something small when it belongs to someone else. I bent lower, wishing I could disappear into the polished marble itself, when an unexpected silence rolled across the ballroom. It moved through the crowd like a slow wave. The laughter faded. Conversation stopped. Even the musicians hesitated for half a note before continuing. I looked up because everyone else was looking somewhere behind me. That was the moment I realized someone had stood up. And somehow, without saying a single word, he had become the only person in the entire room who mattered. The stranger stood with the calm confidence of someone who had never needed to raise his voice to command a room. Every conversation dissolved into uneasy whispers as he crossed the marble floor, each measured step echoing beneath the crystal chandeliers. I had never seen him before, but everyone else clearly had. Men who had been laughing seconds earlier suddenly straightened their jackets. Women lowered their glasses. Even the hotel manager hurried forward before stopping halfway, as though he had remembered there were moments when saying nothing was the wiser choice. I remained frozen beside the growing crimson stain at my feet, still clutching a handful of white linen napkins that had already surrendered to the wine. My heart pounded so loudly I barely noticed him stop beside me. He did not look at the expensive guests first. He looked at me. His gray-blue eyes studied the stain across my uniform for only a second before he quietly slipped off his tailored black jacket. Without asking permission or expecting gratitude, he draped it gently across my shoulders. The ritual settled around me with surprising warmth, shielding the ruined fabric beneath it. His movement was simple, respectful, protective. It felt strangely unfamiliar because no one had treated me with that kind of quiet dignity in a very long time. I looked up, struggling to find words that refused to come. Thank you was trapped somewhere behind my racing heartbeat. He offered the smallest nod, almost as if telling me I did not owe him anything. Then he finally turned toward the table behind us. The man who had dismissed everything with a careless smile shifted uneasily in his chair. I noticed it immediately. Confidence looked different when someone more powerful entered the room. The stranger folded one hand calmly in front of him. His expression never changed. There was no anger in his face, only disappointment so controlled that it somehow carried far more weight. "You seem to have forgotten something," he said in a voice so even that everyone leaned closer to hear. The executive frowned. "Forgotten what?" "An apology." The words landed softly, but the silence afterward felt enormous. Someone cleared a throat across the ballroom. Another guest quietly placed a champagne glass onto a nearby table. The executive forced an awkward laugh that no one joined. "It was only an accident," he replied. The stranger glanced briefly toward the wine, soaking through the napkins in my trembling hands before returning his gaze to the man. "Accidents reveal character," he answered. "So do apologies." My breathing slowed just enough for me to notice details I had missed before. His watch was understated instead of flashy. His suit fit perfectly without demanding attention. He wore no expression of superiority, only complete certainty that respect should never depend on wealth or status. The hotel manager finally reached us, nervously asking whether everything was all right. The stranger answered before anyone else could. "She deserves a few minutes to collect herself. Please make sure someone covers her section." The manager nodded immediately, without hesitation. "Yes, sir. Of course. Sir. Not Mr. Not guest. Just sir," spoken with the kind of instinctive respect that could not be purchased overnight. I watched the manager hurry away while staff members quietly stepped in to help clean the floor. No one laughed anymore. The room had transformed without a single raised voice. As I tightened the borrowed jacket around my shoulders, I realized I still did not know the name of the man standing beside me. Then I heard one frightened whisper drift through the silent ballroom from somewhere behind the crowd. "Adrian Moretti." The name alone changed the air around us. Hearing his name explained the silence better than anything else could have. I had never met Adrian Moretti, but I had heard whispers the way every New Yorker eventually does. Some people called him a brilliant investor. Others claimed he could change the future of a company with a single phone call. No one seemed completely certain where the truth ended and the rumors began. Standing only a few feet away from him, I understood one thing immediately. Whatever people believed about Adrian Moretti, they believed it enough to stop laughing the moment he entered the conversation. The executive cleared his throat and finally looked in my direction instead of through me. His smile had disappeared, replaced by the uncomfortable expression of a man realizing the room was no longer on his side. He shifted in his chair before speaking quietly. "Miss, I apologize. It was careless of me." His words sounded rehearsed, almost borrowed, but they were still words I had never expected to hear. I looked at him for a second, then gave a small nod. "Thank you," I answered. My voice was steadier than I felt. Adrian remained completely still. He did not congratulate the man. He did not lecture him. He simply watched until the apology was finished. Only then did he turn toward me again. "Are you all right, Miss Bennett?" The fact that he knew my last name startled me before I remembered the small badge pinned to my uniform beneath his jacket. I managed another nod. "Yes, I will be fine." He studied my face for a brief moment, as though deciding whether I actually believed my own answer. Then he surprised me again. "Good. Never allow one careless person to convince you that your value depends on their opinion." His voice remained calm, almost gentle, yet every word settled into my memory as if it had been carved into stone. Before I could respond, another member of the hotel staff approached with a fresh uniform folded neatly over one arm. The manager smiled nervously. "Claire, you can take a short break and change. We will handle your tables." Relief washed over me so suddenly that I nearly forgot to breathe. "Thank you," I whispered. As I reached for the replacement uniform, I hesitated. The black jacket still rested across my shoulders, warm despite the cool air flowing through the ballroom. I carefully slipped it off and held it toward Adrian with both hands. "Thank you for your kindness, sir. I appreciate it more than you know." He looked at the jacket but made no effort to take it. "Keep it until your shift ends," he replied. "The hallway to the employee locker room is cold this time of year." It was such an ordinary observation that it almost made me smile. Surrounded by luxury worth millions of dollars, he had noticed the temperature of a service hallway that most guests would never even see. I lowered my eyes for a second, unsure how to answer. No one had paid attention to details like that since my father passed away years earlier. When I finally looked up again, Adrian had already begun walking toward the ballroom exit. Guests stepped aside without being asked. Conversations resumed only after he disappeared beyond the towering glass doors. The music slowly filled the silence again, but something inside me had shifted. I stood there holding the borrowed jacket against my chest, wondering why a man who could have ignored me as easily as everyone else had chosen not to. I had no way of knowing that our paths were far from finished crossing, or that the quiet kindness of a single evening would soon uncover a story neither of us had expected to live. By the time my shift finally ended, the rain had grown heavier, turning the streets outside the hotel into ribbons of reflected light. I changed into my jeans and an old gray sweater, but I folded Adrian Moretti's jacket over my arm instead of leaving it in the employee office. It did not feel right to take it home, yet it felt even less right to leave behind something that had restored more than my confidence that evening. The subway ride back to my apartment in Queens was unusually quiet. I sat beside the rain-covered window, watching strangers disappear beneath umbrellas while replaying every moment in my mind. The laughter, the silence, the apology. His words echoed louder than the train itself. Never allow one careless person to convince you that your value depends on their opinion. I repeated this sentence over and over until it no longer sounded like advice from a stranger. It sounded like something I should have believed years ago. My apartment welcomed me with familiar creaks in the hardwood floor and the comforting hum of an old refrigerator that probably should have been replaced months earlier. It was small, barely 600 square feet, but it was mine. I carefully hung the black jacket across the back of a wooden chair instead of tossing it over the couch. Somehow it deserved more respect than that. Before going to bed, I searched Adrian Moretti's name online, expecting to find photographs from charity events or business magazines. Instead, I found very little. A few interviews, articles praising successful investments, pictures of him cutting ribbons at hospitals and scholarship foundations. Nothing sensational, nothing dramatic. It was almost disappointing after hearing so many rumors. The next morning, I returned to the hotel carrying the jacket inside a clean garment bag. My plan was simple. Find someone from his office. Return it. Thank him properly. Move on with my life. That plan lasted exactly 4 minutes. The hotel manager spotted me before I even reached the employee entrance. "Claire," he called with surprising urgency. "I need to speak with you." His expression was impossible to read. I followed him into his office, where he closed the door before turning toward me. For one nervous second, I wondered whether I had somehow broken another rule. Instead, he handed me a small cream-colored envelope sealed with dark blue wax. "There is a car waiting outside for you after your shift today," he said carefully. "Someone requested that this be delivered personally." I stared at the envelope without touching it. Requested by whom? He hesitated just long enough to answer the question without actually saying the name. "The same gentleman whose jacket you are carrying." My pulse quickened. I accepted the envelope with uncertain hands and broke the seal. Inside rested a single ivory card with one sentence printed in elegant black lettering. "If you still wish to return the jacket, I would appreciate the opportunity to thank you for reminding me that kindness still exists in unexpected places." There was no address beneath the message. Only a time. 6:30 this evening. Along with a small embossed emblem I did not recognize. I read the words twice before looking back at the manager. "There has to be some mistake," I said quietly. "I am only returning something that belongs to him." The manager smiled in a way that suggested he understood far more than he intended to explain. "Miss Bennett," he replied softly, "men like Adrian Moretti do not send handwritten invitations by mistake." As I looked down at the simple card resting in my hands, I realized returning one borrowed jacket might become the beginning of a story neither of us had planned. The rest of my shift passed in a blur. Every time I reached into my apron for an order pad, my fingers brushed against the invitation folded carefully inside my pocket. By 6 o'clock, I had convinced myself not to go at least a dozen times. People from my world did not accept private invitations from men like Adrian Moretti. They returned borrowed jackets, thanked them politely, and disappeared back into ordinary lives. That was how the world stayed balanced. At exactly 6:20, I stepped outside the employee entrance with the garment bag resting over my shoulder. The rain had stopped, leaving the sidewalks shining beneath the evening lights. A black sedan waited quietly along the curb. There were no flashing headlights, no dramatic welcome, Only a driver in a dark suit who opened the rear door before I could even decide whether I was actually getting inside. "Good evening, Miss Bennett," he said with a courteous smile. "Mr. Moretti appreciates your punctuality." I hesitated for another heartbeat before climbing into the car. The ride through Manhattan felt strangely peaceful. We passed familiar streets filled with people rushing home from work, couples carrying grocery bags, runners weaving through traffic lights, and tourists stopping every few feet to photograph buildings that lifelong residents barely noticed anymore. I wondered where Adrian could possibly want to meet. My imagination kept inventing enormous mansions and private penthouses overlooking Central Park. Instead, 20 minutes later, the sedan pulled to a stop beside a quiet brick building overlooking the Hudson River. There were no photographers, no luxury hotel entrance, just a restored waterfront library with warm lights glowing behind tall windows. The driver stepped out first and opened my door. He gestured toward the entrance without saying another word. Inside, the scent of old books and fresh coffee replaced the perfume and polished marble of the ballroom. A few people sat reading near oversized windows while soft jazz drifted through hidden speakers. The atmosphere felt comfortable rather than intimidating. I spotted Adrian standing near a bookshelf, wearing a charcoal sweater beneath a navy overcoat, instead of the perfectly tailored suit from the gala. Without the ballroom around him, he seemed less like a distant legend and more like an ordinary man enjoying a quiet evening. He smiled politely as I approached. "Thank you for coming, Miss Bennett." I held out the garment bag immediately. "I came to return what belongs to you." He accepted it with genuine appreciation before placing it carefully across the back of a nearby chair. Then he surprised me again by extending his hand instead of reaching for the jacket again. "Adrian," he said simply. I shook his hand. "Claire." His handshake was firm but brief, carrying none of the unnecessary confidence I had expected. He motioned toward a small table beside the windows where 2 cups of hot tea waited. "I hope you do not mind that I chose this place instead of a restaurant," he said. Conversations seem more honest around books than around expensive menus. I laughed quietly before I could stop myself. That was probably the first genuine laugh I had experienced since the gala. He noticed it and smiled in return. I realized then that he had not invited me here because of the jacket. The jacket had only been an excuse. Whatever conversation Adrian Moretti intended to have that evening had begun long before I walked through the library doors, and somehow I had become part of a story neither of us fully understood yet. For a while, neither of us reached for the tea. The silence between us did not feel uncomfortable. It felt intentional, as though both of us understood that the first words mattered more than filling the quiet. Outside the tall windows, ferries crossed the Hudson River beneath a sky slowly fading from blue into shades of amber and gray. The library had begun to empty, leaving only the occasional turning page or distant footsteps echoing across the wooden floor. Adrian finally wrapped his hands around the warm cup in front of him without taking a sip. "I owe you an explanation," he said. I smiled politely. "You really do not. I only returned your jacket." He shook his head gently. "No. You returned something much more valuable than that." I looked at him with quiet confusion. "I am afraid I do not understand." He glanced toward the window before answering. "Most people who meet me already believe they know who I am. Some want favors. Others want access. Many simply want to be seen standing next to me. Very few look at me as another human being." He paused for a moment before continuing. "You were the first person in years who thanked me without asking for anything afterward." His honesty caught me off guard. I laughed softly. "That seems like a very low standard." "It should not be," he replied with a faint smile. "But somehow it is." I lowered my eyes toward the steam rising from my tea. "I never wanted anything from you, Adrian. I still do not. That is exactly why I asked you here." His answer settled quietly between us. There was no hidden meaning in his voice. No pressure. Only sincerity. I took my first sip of tea, hoping it would steady the unexpected emotion building inside me. It reminded me of evenings with my mother before life became a constant race between work, bills, and school. Sometimes, ordinary moments carried the greatest weight. Adrian broke the silence again. "Your manager mentioned you were studying nursing." I nodded. "Night classes twice a week. It is taking longer than I expected because I have to work full-time." He listened without interrupting. Most people nodded politely whenever I talked about my goals before quickly changing the subject. Adrian simply listened. My mother always believed nurses changed lives in ways that never made headlines, I continued. She used to tell me kindness was a form of medicine that cost nothing. He smiled with quiet recognition. She sounds like a remarkable woman. She was. We lost her 6 years ago. His expression softened. I am sorry, Claire. There was nothing rehearsed about the sympathy in his voice. It felt genuine, and somehow that made speaking easier. We talked for nearly an hour about ordinary things. Favorite books, childhood neighborhoods, the best coffee shops hidden across the city. There were long pauses that never needed rescuing. For the first time since entering the library, I forgot who Adrian Moretti was supposed to be. He stopped feeling like a powerful businessman surrounded by endless rumors. He became a man who preferred history books over television, remembered every employee's name in his company, and believed respect should never depend on someone's bank account. As the evening drew to a close, I reached for my purse. Thank you for the tea, Adrian. And thank you for what you did that night. He stood as I did, walking beside me toward the library entrance. Before I stepped outside, he spoke one sentence that stayed with me long after the cool evening air surrounded us. Claire, if the world ever tries to convince you that kindness is weakness, remember that the strongest people are usually the quietest. I smiled as I walked toward the waiting sidewalk, unaware that somewhere across the street, hidden behind the reflection of a parked car, someone had been watching our entire conversation with unexpected interest. For the next several days, life settled into something that almost felt normal again. I attended my nursing classes in the evening, worked long shifts at the hotel during the day, and convinced myself that my conversation with Adrian had simply been one unforgettable chapter that belonged in the past. Yet every now and then, I caught myself remembering something he had said, and the memory always arrived at the exact moment I needed it most. I stopped apologizing for things that were not my fault. I lifted my head a little higher when walking through crowded rooms. I even smiled more often, not because life had suddenly become easier, but because someone had reminded me that my worth had never depended on another person's opinion. Then the unexpected began. It started with small details that barely seemed connected. One afternoon, the hotel announced that every service employee would receive a new scholarship program covering professional education. The manager admitted he had no idea who funded it because the donor had requested complete privacy. A week later, the employee break room was renovated with comfortable furniture, fresh meals, and quiet study spaces for staff attending college after work. Again, no public announcement. No ribbon cutting. Only quiet improvements that changed dozens of lives without asking for applause. My coworkers celebrated the changes, but I could not ignore the growing suspicion in my mind. The timing felt too precise. One evening, I finally gathered enough courage to send Adrian a short message using the business card he had discreetly handed me before we left the library. Thank you for the tea. I hope you are doing well. I also wanted to ask whether you know anything about the changes at the hotel. His reply arrived less than 10 minutes later. I am doing well. I hope your classes are going well too. As for the hotel, sometimes good ideas simply find the right people. That was all he wrote. No confirmation. No denial. I smiled despite myself. He had answered the question without answering it. 2 days later, while leaving campus after anatomy class, I noticed an elderly woman struggling with 2 heavy grocery bags outside the subway station. Without thinking, I offered to help carry them the remaining 3 blocks to her apartment. She thanked me all the way there, insisting I reminded her of her granddaughter in Chicago. By the time I reached my own subway platform, I realized I was nearly 15 minutes late. As I hurried down the stairs, I froze for a moment. Across the street, parked beside a coffee shop, sat the same black sedan that had picked me up for the library. The windows were slightly tinted, but I recognized the car immediately. It remained there only a few seconds before quietly driving away with the flow of evening traffic. My first reaction was confusion. My second was something far more complicated. Was Adrian checking on me? Was it coincidence? Or had he simply happened to be nearby? I tried convincing myself that I was imagining connections where none existed, yet the feeling refused to disappear. Later that night, as I unlocked the door to my apartment, I found a small package resting neatly outside. There was no return address. Inside was a brand new medical reference book I had borrowed repeatedly from the campus library because I could never afford my own copy. Tucked between the first pages was a handwritten note containing only one sentence. Invest in people who choose kindness when no one is watching. They always become the strongest part of the future. I read the note 3 times before slowly closing the cover, unaware that someone else had already begun paying close attention to every quiet change taking place around Adrian Moretti and me. The following week, the city seemed unchanged, yet I could not shake the feeling that invisible threads were quietly rearranging the lives around me. Classes became harder as final examinations approached, and every spare hour disappeared between textbooks, hospital training, and late shifts at the hotel. Still, every time exhaustion threatened to overwhelm me, I remembered the handwritten note tucked inside my medical reference book. Invest in people who choose kindness when no one is watching. Somehow those words carried me through the longest days. One Friday afternoon, I finished my shift earlier than expected and decided to walk through Riverside Park before heading home. Autumn had begun painting the trees in shades of amber and crimson, and families filled the walking paths while children chased fallen leaves across the grass. It felt peaceful, ordinary, exactly the kind of afternoon I had missed while spending so much of my life rushing from one responsibility to another. As I sat on a bench reviewing flashcards for an anatomy exam, I noticed someone approaching from the opposite path. Adrian carried 2 paper cups of coffee as though meeting me there had been the most natural thing in the world. I looked at him with surprised amusement. "Are you following me now?" He smiled before handing me one of the cups. "No, but I did ask someone where your favorite park was after you mentioned it at the library." I laughed softly. "That sounds slightly less reassuring than you probably intended." He laughed as well, and the sound felt surprisingly genuine. For nearly an hour we walked along the river, speaking about everything except business. He asked about my classes, remembered details from conversations we had weeks earlier, and somehow made me feel that every answer mattered. Eventually, I stopped beside the railing overlooking the water. "Adrian, can I ask you something honestly?" "Of course. Why me? Out of everyone you could spend time with, why are you here talking to a hotel employee who still borrows textbooks because she cannot afford to buy them?" He remained quiet for several seconds, watching the afternoon sunlight dance across the river before answering. "Because the night we met, everyone in that ballroom revealed exactly who they were. Some laughed, some looked away, some pretended nothing had happened. You apologized for an accident that was never your fault because you cared more about other people than your own embarrassment. That tells me more about a person than any resume or biography ever could." I lowered my eyes, unsure how to respond. He continued speaking before I could interrupt. "Claire, success has introduced me to thousands of impressive people. Character has introduced me to very few unforgettable ones." His words settled into the quiet space between us with unexpected warmth. At that moment, my phone vibrated. A message from my classmate Emily appeared across the screen. "Claire, are you with Adrian Moretti right now?" Confused, I quickly replied asking how she could possibly know. Her response arrived almost immediately. "Someone posted photographs online from the park this afternoon. People are already making up stories." I felt my stomach tighten as I looked around for the first time. Across the walking path, a man lowered his phone the moment our eyes met before disappearing into the crowd. Adrian noticed my expression change. "What happened?" I handed him the phone without saying a word. He read the message calmly, then returned it to me. His face revealed no panic, only quiet disappointment. "It seems our peaceful afternoon has attracted more attention than either of us wanted." I had no idea that a few unnoticed photographs would soon force both of us to confront a world where kindness was often misunderstood by people searching for something far more dramatic. The photographs spread across social media faster than either of us expected, but the stories people invented revealed far more about them than about us. Some claimed I was chasing wealth. Others insisted Adrian was hiding a secret engagement. Complete strangers confidently described conversations that had never happened. At first, I tried reading every comment, believing I could somehow understand why kindness made so many people suspicious. By midnight, I closed my phone and slipped it into a drawer. The opinions of people who had never met me could not become the soundtrack of my life. The next morning, Adrian called for the first time. His voice remained calm, exactly as it had been the night we met. "Claire, I am sorry this happened. You never asked to be part of public attention." I smiled despite the difficult week. "Neither did you." He was quiet for a moment before speaking again. "There is a charity scholarship ceremony this evening. I planned to attend weeks ago. I would understand completely if you prefer to stay away. I looked at the white nursing uniform hanging beside my bedroom door, then at the medical reference book he had quietly given me. Running away would only allow strangers to decide my story for me. I will be there, I answered. The ceremony took place in the same ballroom where everything had begun nearly a year earlier. The crystal chandeliers still shimmered above polished marble floors. The orchestra still played gentle music beneath the laughter of distinguished guests. Yet everything felt different because I had changed. I no longer walked with my eyes lowered toward the floor. I greeted hotel employees by name. I thanked the servers placing water glasses on each table because I remembered exactly how invisible that work could feel. Adrian noticed every small interaction without saying a word. When the scholarship recipients were introduced, I heard my own name called unexpectedly. Confused, I walked toward the stage as the host explained that a new annual nursing scholarship would now support students balancing full-time work with medical education. The award carried no family name and honored no corporation. It was simply called the Dignity Scholarship. My hands trembled as I accepted the certificate. Looking toward the audience, I found Adrian standing quietly near the back instead of occupying the front row reserved for major donors. He applauded exactly like everyone else, asking for no recognition despite knowing the program existed because of him. After the ceremony ended, I crossed the ballroom to thank him, but before I could speak he held out something carefully folded across his arm. It was the same black jacket from the night our paths first crossed. I thought this belonged to you now, I said with a smile. He shook his head gently. It belonged to a moment. Tonight belongs to you. Instead of handing it back, he paused. May I? I nodded. He placed the jacket lightly across my shoulders exactly as he had done that first evening. Except this time, there was no embarrassment to hide, no stain to cover, only quiet respect shared between two people who had learned that dignity could never be measured by wealth or status. I looked at him and smiled before speaking the words my heart had carried since the night we met. You did not save my dignity that evening, Adrian. You reminded me that nobody could ever take it away. His smile was small but genuine. Around us, conversations continued, glasses clinked softly, and the city carried on beyond the ballroom windows. Yet I finally understood something my mother had tried to teach me years before. Power may capture attention for a moment, but kindness earns a place in someone's life forever.